I'm Jared Bowen.
And I'm Adam Riley, filling in for Emily Rooney tonight.
Remember back in October 2012, Superstorm Sandy barreled up the East Coast and took a left turn about 200 miles south of here, devastating the New Jersey and New York coast. Boston got a lucky break. It was spared, and since then, coastal cities around the region have been bracing for another catastrophic storm.
As part of this week's in-depth focus report, we're looking at whether Boston is taking that threat seriously enough. In New York, there's talk of moving structures further inland, but as I discovered, Boston is taking a different approach.
These images show what a Hurricane Sandy-style storm could do to Boston, leaving a huge portion of the city underwater and causing massive economic damage. It's a scary scenario, but not, Brian Sweat says, a hopeless one.
We can build better buildings that are more resilient, both by elevating critical infrastructure, by how we design them, by making them more flood prepared.
Sweat is Boston's chief of environment and energy. He says the city needs to embrace resiliency, in essence, making sure Boston's buildings can survive a disastrous flood.
We missed a 100-year flooding event from Sandy by 5 hours. Nemo, we missed a 100-year flooding event by 3 hours. We would have seen water through Faneuil Hall Marketplace.
The best response, Sweat says, is designing new structures that can take a beating from the climate and retrofitting old buildings to keep them safe, too.
We're going to turn over our buildings and rehab our buildings significantly between now and 2050. If you're replacing your boiler plant, if you're replacing your central heating facility, is it in the right location? Right? If you've put it in the basement, is it possible to move it to a different floor?
What Boston won't do, Sweat says, is turn its back on the water.
One of the things we're not thinking about is moving the city backwards, right? We're a city on water. That's where folks want to be.
Case in point, the South Boston Waterfront, which has become Boston's hottest new neighborhood. But according to Vivian Lee of the Boston Harbor Association, some developers aren't taking climate change seriously enough.
Very prominent waterfront developer came with a proposal for a building that had 3 levels of parking underground. And when we said, what are you going to do for climate change? He said, well, you know, we have sandbags ready.
But others are embracing resiliency. The new Spalding Rehab Hospital in Charlestown is right on the water and built accordingly.
What we're seeing here is our combined heat and power unit for the building.
Designer David Burson says the key parts of Spalding's physical plant are on or near the roof, including crucial electrical switches and emergency generators.
These are here to basically run all of the critical life safety systems in the building in the event of a major power outage, extreme weather event.
Even the windows are designed with previous catastrophes in mind.
What they ended up doing in Memorial Hospital in New Orleans was breaking the windows open with the furniture so that they could allow the patients to breathe. If there is an emergency situation, you can open this window, you get fresh air, you can keep people in here for days or weeks at a time, keep them safe.
Right now, Spalding is the exception, but it may become the norm because Boston is a seaport city, for better or worse.
Jared, there is a requirement now that developers show the city they're taking the threats from climate change seriously before they're allowed to build. But that requirement was only created this past November, right before Tom Menino left the mayor's job, and obviously a whole lot of building went on before it was implemented.
Yeah, so are there any guidelines now to implement some of the changes we just saw at Spalding, putting facilities on the roof for developers?
Developers need to show they're taking the issues seriously. They don't need to do, say, 3 specific things or a half dozen things. They just need to show they're taking into account. There's a lot of individual discretion still allowed. All
right, we want to broaden the conversation now. Right now, we're joined by George Bachrach. He's the president of the Environmental League of Massachusetts and a former state senator. Welcome to Greater Boston.
Thank you, Jared. Adam?
So, thanks. George, why is resiliency the plan and not building a seawall or moving the entire city back in stages, as we just saw in Adam's piece?
Well, Boston is a great city, and one of the things that makes Boston a great city is its proximity to the water. It would make no sense to retreat from the water. But Brian Sweat has a line that I think works well here, which is build it once. So if we're going to build out Seaport District, then we have to do it in a way that it can withstand storms, which means moving operating systems, moving safety systems up, off, out of the basement and to higher floors. I think Mayor Menino got this, and I think the new mayor, Marty Walsh, also gets it.
Let's bring in another voice. Vivian Lee is president of the Boston Harbor Association, also a member of Marty Walsh's, Mayor Marty Walsh's transition team, focusing on transportation issues. Vivian, thanks for being here. So why did it take the Boston Redevelopment Authority so long to implement that requirement that we talked about a moment ago, that developers show they're taking threats from climate change seriously? Why November 2012 for that as opposed to 2010 or 2008?
You know, when we had a first ever Boston Harbor Sea Level Rise conference in 2010, 450 people came to the conference. But then they all went away. You know, it seemed so long and so far away before anything would happen. And it was really Hurricane Sandy that was the wake-up call. And I think subsequent to that, subsequent to October 2012, all the agencies said, you know, what can we do? What can we get buy-in from the business community, real estate, developers and such? And it took a little while to get the support of the business community. But after, you know, Hurricane Sandy, I think many of them stepped up to the plate, like Boston Properties and others.
How alarmed is everyone? We saw the pictures of Wall Street and the southern tip of Manhattan with Sandy and what happened there. People spent weeks and months without electricity while they were dealing with the flooding. So is there a reality check here? Do people, are they ready for the fact that that could very well happen here?
I think people are starting to do the vulnerability reports and analysis to see what they have to do for their own properties. And they're hiring the engineers and the consultants to help them with that. And I think that over the next 5 or 6 years, you're going to see many more buildings being built to be resilient, as George had talked about.
I think one of the turning points here is now people understand that climate change is not merely an environmental concern, it's an economic issue. Right. The city of New York, New Jersey were devastated. Businesses were shut down, schools, hospitals, subway systems. And that's what would have happened here. 83 million square feet of Boston would have been underwater. 83 million square feet if Hurricane Sandy had hit a few hours earlier at high tide. And so we need to figure out ways to preserve or protect the subway system, the MBTA. We need to move, you know, the operating systems, as I mentioned earlier, up above ground. But we can do it. I mean, the South Boston Seaport, which is one of the most vulnerable areas, is really not all that built out yet. There's still time.
I'm curious about the extent to which economics might be driving the way we've chosen to address this problem. Brian Sweat made it clear to me when we spoke that the land along the waterfront that was opened up after the Big Dig was finished is incredibly attractive to developers. And I'm wondering if that is why, at least in part, we're choosing to go with the resiliency approach, because frankly, there's so much money to be made on the waterfront if you're a developer, and whether in 20 or 30 years we might not look back at that and say, ooh, that wasn't the right decision, really.
Well, I think it's hard to predict what we will know 50 years from now. But clearly you can build in a way that is environmentally sensitive, that takes into account sea level rise and storm surge. And what we're finding is more and more businesses are starting to do that. And so I think that, you know, as we said to Joe Fallon this morning at a meeting, you know, we don't want Spalding Rehab to be the only example of a building that's done correctly. We want what you're doing on the Fan Pier and what your colleagues will do in South Boston to be future
As you said, this is Fan Pier developer Joe Fallon. What was his response?
He says we are. He says all of my buildings in the future, the next 4 buildings I'm going to be built, are absolutely going to be resilient. And I think he really learned from Hurricane Sandy. He talked about the consultants he hired. He had a landscape architect look at what they can do with landscaping as well. So I think that they're becoming much more sensitive.
What are we using for a precedent right now? Right after the holidays, I was in Holland. The Netherlands, which of course is a country that's underwater. Their engineers frequently come over. I mean, what is the precedent we're looking at, and where are we drawing from to try to create a plan for here in Boston?
Well, there's extraordinary new technology out there. For example, impermeable materials. We don't need to be building roadways and horizontal space with impermeable materials that will just create rivers of water in these situations, but materials that will soak up the water, bring it back down below ground. There are all sorts of technologies that we have in terms of strengthening the buildings. You know, one of the areas that we're doing now in the city of Boston is the retrofitting of older buildings so that there are fewer greenhouse gas emissions. This is a mosaic at the end of the day. There's no one answer to the problem. Part of it is adaptation, protecting the buildings. Part of it is doing things that diminish the likelihood of rising climate.
When I spoke with Brian Sweat, I ended up actually really rattled toward the end of our interview because the steps he was describing that he thought would be necessary, you know, over the next few decades to get Boston and Massachusetts ready for an event like this. There's so much work to be done. You mentioned the T a moment ago. I found myself wondering if we shouldn't be trying to take the Green Line from underground and elevate it, you know. Other things like that, you know, sewer pipes that if they are below ocean level will just run backwards into the city as opposed to out into the ocean. Is this going to take sort of a big dig level project or something that makes the big dig look small for us to be ready, or can it be done incrementally over time without too much disruption?
I think it can be done incrementally, and all of the agencies that you mentioned are actually looking at. So Boston Water and Sewer has an analysis about what future efforts they need to do. The MWRA has already elevated Deer Island, so they're not going to have the types of problems that you're talking about. The T, together with Mass DOT, looking at what can be done for roadways and also the subway system. And Massport is also looking at what they can do for the airport and their facilities as well. So you're seeing the agencies really taking a proactive approach, frankly, since October 2012. And I think that, if you were to come back to them in 2 years, you will see significant progress in terms of what is put into the capital budgets, what they're doing to reinforce their infrastructure and such. I'm very encouraged, more so than I was a year ago, frankly.
But it takes more investment.
I was going to say, what happens if it happens this fall?
It takes more investment. So I agree with Vivian. But, for example, at the state level, all state spending on all environmental protection in the Commonwealth is less than 1% of the state budget. Less than 1%. For all the things we do on the environment. It's not enough. And so, we've learned in our advocacy work, it's not about asking people whether they're with us. They all are. The question is, what will you do? And that's a whole different answer.
All right, well, George Bachrach, Vivian Lee, thank you so much for your insight on this.